Arthur never thought I was paying attention. That was his first mistake, and, as it turned out, his last. For 11 years, I sat across from him at dinner tables and boardroom teas and charity luncheons and smiled the smile he had decided meant I wasn't listening. He spoke over me. He finished my sentences with the wrong words and never noticed. He told his associates that I had a talent for roses and not much else, and they laughed, and I poured the tea, and I listened to every single word. He sent me to clean the attic on a Tuesday morning in October 1962. He wanted the space for his mistress's things.
No, it can't be.
What he didn't know was that my grandfather had been there before me, and my grandfather, unlike Arthur, had understood exactly what he was leaving behind, and for whom. If you love stories about women who were underestimated, overlooked and written off, and who turned that into the most powerful thing in the room, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to The Final Turn, leave your like, and stay until the end. The best stories are the ones nobody saw coming. I married Arthur Hale Pemberton in the spring of 1951, which was, by any reasonable measure, considered an excellent match for a woman of my position. He was handsome in the manner of men who have been told so since boyhood and have organised their entire personalities around the fact. He had a title. Well, the suggestion of one, a baronetcy that had been in his family for 2 generations and which he wore like a man wearing someone else's coat with great confidence and very little right. What Arthur had in truth was charm, and what charm does in the right drawing room at the right moment is make people overlook the absence of everything else. My family had the substance. The Ashworth estate in Surrey had been in my grandfather's name since before the war, properly legally, with documents filed at the proper offices and witnessed by the proper people. There were lands in Cornwall and Derbyshire, mining interests that my grandfather had quietly accumulated over 30 years of careful work, and a house in Mayfair that my mother had always referred to as the London pied-à-terre, with the particular English understatement that means it was worth considerably more than anyone was prepared to say out loud. Arthur brought himself. That was the sum of it. I understood this on our wedding day and chose not to dwell on it because I was 23 and he was charming, and the roses in the church were very beautiful, and sometimes that is simply how it goes. By 1962, the charm had worn to the backing, and what remained was considerably less attractive. He had been through 2 of my grandfather's solicitors, replaced them with his own men, and was working his way through the estate with the focused efficiency of someone who had been planning it for years. Which, I eventually understood, he had. The morning he sent me to the attic began like most mornings in the Surrey house, Arthur at the head of the breakfast table with his Times and his kippers, and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has confused inheritance with achievement. 2 of his associates arriving at 9:30, men in good suits with the careful eyes of people paid to look the other way. Tea served by Mrs. Briggs, who had been with the house since my grandfather's time, and who communicated her opinion of Arthur exclusively through the precision with which she set his cup slightly further from his reach than anyone else's. I sat at the other end of the table and ate my toast, and listened. Arthur was explaining, to his associates and incidentally to me, that the attic required clearing. The house needed to be made more practical, he said, with the tone of a man who has decided what practical means and expects no discussion. There was wasted space up there, he continued, that could be put to better use. A proper office was needed, for administrative purposes. His associate, a thin man named Whitmore who I had never trusted, nodded in the way of someone who already knows the plan and is pretending to hear it for the first time. I knew about the mistress. I had known for 14 months. Her name was Diane, and she worked at a gallery in Knightsbridge, and Arthur believed, with the touching confidence of a man who underestimates his wife, that I had no idea. He looked at me over the top of his Times. He said, "Elizabeth, I think it would be most useful if you spent the morning upstairs. The attic wants sorting. There's rather a lot of your grandfather's old things gathering dust. He said your grandfather the way he always said it, with a slight emphasis, as if the connection between me and the man who had built everything Arthur was currently dismantling was somehow quaint. I folded my napkin. I said, "Of course, Arthur. I'll see to it directly." Mrs. Briggs clearing the plates did not look at me, but I saw her shoulders settle in a way that meant she had heard everything and was reserving judgment until further notice. I went upstairs. The attic of Ashworth Manor smelled of camphor and old paper and the particular stillness of rooms that have not been disturbed in a very long time. The light came through a single north-facing window, grey and flat, the kind of October light that makes everything look as though it has been waiting. Arthur's instructions had been to clear it, to sort through what was there and dispose of what wasn't wanted. I had brought no one with me. Mrs. Briggs had offered and I had declined, which she had accepted with the wordless understanding of a woman who has worked in a house long enough to know when something is not her business and when it is. The room was fuller than I had expected. My grandfather had been a methodical man, and the attic reflected it. Boxes labelled in his hand, trunks arranged by year, nothing left carelessly. I moved through it slowly, unhurried, opening and closing, reading and setting aside. It was in the far corner behind a travelling trunk that still had a Cunard label on the handle that I found the iron chest. It was not large, the size of a small suitcase perhaps, with the Ashworth crest pressed into the lid and a lock that took the smaller of the two keys on my grandfather's keyring, which I had kept in my dressing table drawer since his death and which Arthur had never thought to ask about. The key turned. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had kept out 11 years of attic damp, were documents. A great many documents. And on top of them, in my grandfather's handwriting on a cream envelope sealed with the family crest in wax, my name. Not Arthur's name, not the estate's name. Mine. My full name, in my grandfather's hand, written with the deliberateness of a man who wanted there to be absolutely no confusion about his intentions. I sat down on the travelling trunk with the envelope in my lap and the October light coming through the window and listened to the house settle around me. Then I broke the seal and began to read. My grandfather had been a solicitor before he made his money. That was something Arthur had always found mildly embarrassing. Trade, he called it, with the particular inflection of a man whose own grandfather had been considerably less distinguished, but had managed to acquire a title along the way and was therefore exempt from scrutiny. What it meant in practice was that my grandfather understood documents the way other men understood weather, instinctively, completely, with a clear sense of what was coming. The envelope contained a letter, 6 pages, written in his precise hand, dated the spring of 1949, 2 years before my marriage to Arthur, which I noted with the particular chill of understanding that he had known. He had seen Arthur clearly from the beginning and had said nothing to me because I was 22 and in love, and there are things you cannot tell a person who is not yet ready to hear them. But he had prepared. The letter explained everything with the methodical clarity of a man filing a brief. The Ashworth estate, the Surrey house, the London property, the Cornwall and Derbyshire lands, the mining interests, had been placed in a private trust in my name in 1948, 1 year before his death. The trust had been registered with his own firm, not the London solicitors Arthur had subsequently replaced. The documents in the chest were the originals. Arthur's name appeared nowhere in the trust. He had been given access to certain accounts as a matter of domestic convenience, housekeeping in the legal sense, but had no ownership of anything. Not the house, not the lands, not the investments. What he had signed over 11 years were documents that his own solicitors had told him transferred assets to his name. What those documents actually were, my grandfather had anticipated with uncomfortable precision. Forgeries, or near enough, that would not survive scrutiny by anyone who looked at the original trust with sufficient care. Arthur had been spending money that was never his to spend. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it precisely along its original creases, replaced it in the envelope, and put everything back in the iron chest exactly as I had found it. Then I went downstairs, asked Mrs. Briggs for a fresh pot of Earl Grey, and sat in the morning room looking out at the garden while the tea steeped. Arthur was in his study with Whitmore. I could hear them laughing about something. I drank my tea and thought about my grandfather, and thought about what came next, and felt for the first time in 11 years of marriage entirely and completely calm. His name was Mr. Cavendish. He had been my grandfather's solicitor for 30 years and had retired to a quiet practice in Gray's Inn, the kind of office that doesn't advertise itself, that operates through reputation and introduction and the particular discretion of men who have spent their careers knowing things they were paid never to say. I telephoned him on a Wednesday morning, not from the house. Arthur monitored the telephone bills with the attention he applied to nothing else in our domestic life, which told me everything I needed to know about where his real concerns lay. Mr. Cavendish remembered me. He had known me since I was a child and had attended my grandfather's funeral and had sent a note when I married Arthur that had been perfectly correct in every particular and entirely devoid of warmth, which I understood now as the closest he could come to expressing an opinion he was not at liberty to voice. I told him what I had found. He listened without interrupting, which barristers and good solicitors learn early and never unlearn. When I finished, there was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he said, "Your grandfather asked me to make myself available to you if this day ever came." I told him I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He said he hoped so too. I said, "It is necessary." He said, "I know. Can you come to London on Friday?" I said, "I can come to London on Friday." I told Arthur I was visiting a friend in Kensington for the day. He was reading the racing pages and said something that might have been fine without looking up. I put on my good coat, the camel aquascutum that had been my mother's, and took the train from Guildford and walked into Mr. Cavendish's office at 10:30 on a cold November morning, and began, quietly and without drama, to take back everything that had always been mine. What followed took 4 months. I want to be clear about that, not because it was slow, but because it was deliberate. My grandfather had been deliberate, Mr. Cavendish was deliberate, and I had spent 11 years watching Arthur operate with the impatience of a man who believed that speed was the same thing as power, and I had learned in that time that it was not. London in those months was cold and particular. I came up twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always with a reason Arthur found plausible. A friend, a committee, the kind of vague charitable obligations that wives of a certain station were expected to maintain, and that husbands of Arthur's disposition were relieved not to be asked about. He never questioned me. That was the thing about being invisible for 11 years. When you finally start moving, nobody notices. Mr. Cavendish had located Arthur's debts with the thoroughness of a man who had been expecting to do exactly this for some time. They were considerable. Arthur had been borrowing against assets he didn't own, signing notes at his club and at the races and through Whitmore's various introductions, with the breezy confidence of a man who believes the money will always be there because it always has been. The notes were held by several parties: a moneylender in the city, 2 private investors, a bank in Lombard Street that had been increasingly uncomfortable about the arrangement for some months. Cavendish approached each of them quietly, through intermediaries, with cash. My cash, properly mine, from accounts Arthur had never known existed, maintained by Mr. Cavendish's firm since my grandfather's death. I bought Arthur's debts one by one. Not quickly, carefully, the way you play chess when you are not in a hurry and the other person doesn't know they're in a game. By February, I held every note Arthur had signed. Everyone. He was still going to his club, still backing horses, still telling Whitmore about his plans for the Mayfair property. I came home from London on a Thursday evening and found him in the library reading the evening paper. He looked up and said, "Good day." I said, "Very productive, thank you." He went back to his paper. I went upstairs and changed for dinner and thought about my grandfather and thought about patience, and thought about the particular satisfaction of a thing done completely and correctly and without anyone knowing until the moment you choose. That moment was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather. Not with drama, but with certainty. Arthur arrived home on a Friday afternoon in March with a solicitor I had never met, and a leather folder under his arm, and the expression of a man who has been anticipating a moment for some time and has finally decided it has come. He found me in the library. I was reading Trollope, as it happened, which my grandfather had always said was the best preparation for understanding how the English actually behave, as opposed to how they present themselves. Mrs. Briggs had brought tea at 4, and it was still warm. Arthur's solicitor was a young man named Graves, who had the careful eyes of someone doing something he had been well paid to do and had decided not to examine too closely. He stood slightly behind Arthur in the way of men who understand their position in a room. Arthur set the leather folder on the table between us. He said, "I think it's time we discuss the situation, Elizabeth." I set down my book. I said, "Do sit down, Arthur. Would you like tea?" He didn't sit down. He opened the folder and pushed it toward me. Inside, separation papers, properly drawn, with the Ashworth properties listed as assets to be divided, the Surrey house marked for sale. He had been thorough. I gave him that. He said, "I think you'll find the terms are more than reasonable. The London flat will be sold. You'll have an allowance, monthly, through Graves here. Enough to live on, if you're sensible about it." He said if you're sensible about it with the particular inflection of a man who has decided the woman across from him has never been sensible about anything and doesn't expect her to start now. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at Arthur. Then I picked up the teapot. I said, "I'll pour, shall I? It would be a shame to let it go cold." Arthur's expression shifted slightly. Not much, but enough. He had expected tears or argument, or the tight-lipped, wounded silence he had learned to interpret as capitulation. He had not expected tea. He sat down. I let him drink his tea. That was important. I wanted him comfortable. I wanted him in his chair with his cup in his hand and his folder on the table and his solicitor standing behind him, all of it exactly as he had arranged it, because what I was about to do would land considerably harder from a position of apparent domesticity than from any other. I set down my cup. I opened the bureau drawer beside my chair, the one Arthur had never opened because it was on my side of the library and he had never been curious about anything on my side of anything. I placed 3 documents on the table. The first was the trust deed. My grandfather's handwriting on the first page, my name throughout, registered and witnessed, and entirely beyond dispute. The second was Mr. Cavendish's legal summary, 12 pages, precise and thorough, detailing the assets Arthur believed he owned, the documents he had signed, and why none of it would survive a proper examination. The third was a schedule of promissory notes, every debt Arthur had signed in the past 4 years, each one now held by a trust registered in my name through Mr. Cavendish's firm. I slid them across the table one at a time, in order, without speaking. Arthur picked up the first document. He read the first page. He turned to the second. Something happened to his face that I had not seen before in 11 years of marriage. A kind of structural failure, as if the architecture of his confidence had encountered something it hadn't been built to withstand. Young Graves leaned forward and read over Arthur's shoulder. He straightened up slowly. He did not look at Arthur. Arthur said, "This isn't..." He stopped. He said, "These can't be." I said, "Arthur, I think you'll find they are." He looked at me across the table. For the first time in 11 years, he looked at me the way you look at someone you have been badly wrong about for a very long time and have only just understood it. I said, "You sent me to clean the attic. You wanted it cleared for Diane's things. I found my grandfather's chest instead. He had been waiting rather a long time for someone to open it." Arthur said nothing. I stood. I smoothed my skirt. I said, "This house has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it. My mother grew up in it. I was born in the East Bedroom on a February morning in 1928, and I have lived here, on and off, for every year of my life since. You have lived here for 11 years as my husband. And before that," I paused, "you were never here at all." I walked to the door and opened it. In the hallway, 2 men from Mr. Cavendish's firm stood waiting. They had arrived at 3:30, while Arthur was still on the train from London, and Mrs. Briggs had shown them in without a word and offered them biscuits, which they had accepted. I said, "Arthur, I think it's time you left. Your things will be forwarded." Arthur stood. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Graves, who had the expression of a man calculating how quickly he could distance himself from this particular client. He looked at me. He said, "Elizabeth." I said, "Goodbye, Arthur." Outside, it had begun to rain. The fine, persistent English rain that makes no drama of itself, but soaks through everything eventually. Arthur Hale Pemberton walked out of Ashworth Manor under that rain with his leather folder and his solicitor and nothing else, and I stood in the doorway and watched him go and felt the house settle around me the way it always had, solidly, quietly, entirely certain of itself. Mrs. Briggs appeared at my elbow with a fresh pot of tea. She said, "Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? It's getting dark." I said, "Yes." "Thank you, Mrs. Briggs." I went back to the library. I picked up my trollop. I found my page. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the house was warm and quiet and entirely, completely mine. The legal proceedings took 8 months. Arthur contested everything, which Mr. Cavendish had anticipated and prepared for with the thoroughness of a man who had been waiting 30 years to have this particular argument and intended to win it comprehensively. He won it comprehensively. Arthur's solicitors, Graves, had departed within a week, citing a conflict of interest that everyone understood meant he had looked at the documents properly and decided he would rather not, were replaced by a firm from the Strand who lasted 6 months before advising their client, apparently with some force, that the position was indefensible and that continued resistance would result in costs that would make the outcome considerably worse. Arthur settled in November. The terms were not generous. They were, Mr. Cavendish observed, with the measured satisfaction of a man who does not permit himself excessive displays of emotion, appropriate. The Mayfair property remained mine. The Cornwall and Derbyshire interests remained mine. The Surrey house, Ashworth Manor, my grandfather's house, my mother's house, the house where I was born on a February morning in 1928, remained mine. Arthur moved to a flat in Bayswater. I know this because Mrs. Briggs had a cousin who lived nearby and mentioned it once briefly in the way of information offered without comment and not requiring a response. I did not ask about Diane. I assumed she had made her own calculations and acted accordingly. Women generally do. I had the attic properly sorted in the spring of 1963, not cleared, sorted. My grandfather's things were catalogued and organised with the help of a young woman from the village who had an eye for order and a useful absence of curiosity about why certain boxes were marked with legal seals and others were not. The iron chest went back to the corner where I had found it, locked, with the key on my dressing table where it had always been. I redecorated the library, not dramatically. New curtains, the chairs recovered in a fabric my mother had always liked, the trollop reorganised by publication date rather than alphabetically, which is how my grandfather had kept them and which I had always considered the correct way. I continued to pour tea at the appropriate times. I continued to wear my good coat to London when occasion required. I continued, in all the ways that were visible to the outside world, to conduct myself exactly as I always had, with the particular composure that the English mistake for coldness, and that is, in fact, simply the understanding that most situations do not require drama and that the ones which do will announce themselves without assistance. My grandfather's portrait hangs in the hall. It always has. He is looking slightly to the left of the painter, which was a habit he had in life. He was always looking at something just past what other people were looking at, seeing something they hadn't noticed yet. I understand that now in a way I didn't when I was young. He had seen Arthur clearly from the beginning. He had prepared everything and waited and trusted that I would find it when I needed to. He was right. He was, in my experience, almost always right. The roses in the garden came up particularly well that spring. I tended them myself in the mornings before the post arrived. Arthur had once said I should be looking after the roses while he saved the business. He was not entirely wrong about the roses. He was wrong about almost everything else. But the roses that spring were really very fine. If you love stories about women who said nothing, planned everything, and let the truth do the work, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to The Final Turn, leave your like, and come back next week. Because the best revenge is always served with a perfectly poured cup of tea.